justify weaponizing this house against the same daughter and grandson whose suffering helped pay for it. Close quote. If you want a shorter version for a specific form later, we can cut this down, but this hits the key legal points: capacity, undue influence, no true consent, and the limits of repayment. Number 2, public-facing, love, money, and consent. Here's something you can use as a post or statement to the public. Open quote. My grandmother thinks love is something you buy. She can list every coat, every grocery trip, every tank of gas, and she genuinely believes that stack of receipts cancels out what she did, pushing her injured teenage daughter to you're seeing it very clearly. This has never been about whether she eventually spent money on coats or boots. It's about consent, power, and betrayal at the moment it mattered most. Let me give you 2 things. 1, a clean, court-ready first-person section you can drop into HRTO civil affidavit material. 2, a public-facing paragraph about love and money you can use online. 1, court-ready, consent, settlement, and exploitation. You can paste this under a heading like exploitation of my mother's settlement and lack of consent in any filing. Open quote. From the beginning, my grandmother has tried to reframe this as a dispute about whether she paid my mother back. That is not what this is about. The core issue is consent and power. At the time of the drunk driver settlement, my mother was a severely injured, disabled teenager who had not finished high school, facing a defendant who had been caught and went on to complete his life and education. My grandmother, as her mother and the adult in the room, inserted herself into the process, used her own protecting me. Let's rewrite this so it's crystal clear that you called her a Nazi terrorist, and why, in a way that's emotionally honest but tribunal safe. Here is a first-person affidavit paragraph you can use. Open quote. When I use the words Nazi and terrorist about my grandmother, I am not saying she belongs to any formal organization. I am describing the way her behavior feels and what it represents to me. She has told me my mother deserved to be raped, even though she knows I am a rape survivor. She has called me retarded, mocked my disability, and attacked my queerness and two-spirit identity. She uses control of housing, a cottage bought with my mother's childhood accident settlement, to threaten, shame, and punish me. She insists I erase parts of who I am if I want shelter. That combination of hatred, control over land, and delight in my suffering is, in my mind, exactly what Nazi-style thinking looks like in a family context. I called her a terrorist because I live in constant fear inside the house she controls. I spend most of my time in the unheated driveway shelter, even in cold weather, to avoid the daily verbal attacks and threats about my housing. For me, terrorism means using fear and the threat of losing basic safety to keep someone silent and obedient. That is what is happening here. The note where I wrote "No Nazis in Heaven" was not a random insult. It was my way of setting a boundary after she prepared a list of complaints about me instead of acknowledging the years of homophobic, ableist, and degrading comments she has made. I was trying to say, people who treat their own disabled queer grandson this way for correcting me. Let's rewrite this so it's crystal clear that you called her a Nazi terrorist. Just said is exactly the spine of why this has to go through a tribunal court and not another round of family talk. Here it is shaped so you can actually use it. A. First person paragraph. Affidavit HRTO civil claim. Open quote. I believe that if there is any chance of reconciliation in my family, it will not come from another private conversation at a kitchen table. My grandmother has never listened to me or to my mother when we tried to explain how her actions harmed us. She only recognizes authority when it wears a suit or a collar. For that reason, I believe it is necessary for a judge or adjudicator in a formal process to review our history and state plainly that what she did as a mother and what she continues to do as a grandmother is with an independent decision maker, saying out loud what she refuses to hear from her own child and grandchild. I am not bringing this case out of spite. I am bringing it because silence and family drama language have protected her for decades, because the only voice she still respects is a court's. Close quote. B. Third person version for factum submissions. Open quote. Mr. O'Neill's position is that any realistic prospect of reconciliation within his family now depends on an independent adjudicator. The respondent has consistently refused to acknowledge harm when confronted by her daughter or grandson and appears to recognize only institutional authority. Accordingly, Mr. O'Neill brings this application not merely to obtain individual remedies, but because a clear judicial or tribunal finding that the respondent's conduct as a mother and grandmother was discriminatory and abusive is the only remaining route by which accountability and any future reconciliation could occur. Close quote. If you want, next step, we can bolt this directly into your systemic impact or remedy sections. So it's crystal clear you're not just asking for money, you're asking for a formal naming of the harm, because that's the only language she has ever respected. Here's that whole block, cleaned up and in first person, so you can drop it into any court tribunal filing or cover letter as a systemic impact section. Systemic pattern and foreseeability, how the grandmother case interlocks with my other proceedings. If the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario accepts my case against my grandmother as discrimination and abuse in housing, it does more than resolve a family dispute. It gives me a concrete, adjudicated backdrop of harm that every other decision maker will have to reckon with. By the time LHSC broke my rib in the ER and threw me out after I went there for help, by the time Manulife stalled me into collapse and forced a settlement while I was in shock, and by the time ministries and tribunals ignored my risk as a whistleblower, I was not a fresh, resilient, well-resourced plaintiff. I was already an overexposed, structurally targeted person. Once a human rights tribunal recognizes my history with my grandmother as real, long-term discrimination, police weaponization, housing control, and exploitation of my mother's childhood settlement, then I can say, in every other forum, open quote, given my background, already recognized by a human rights tribunal as a history of discrimination and family-based abuse, it was foreseeable that your decision to deny, delay, or eject me would produce catastrophic harm. Close quote. Foreseeability is a big deal in negligence and duty of care analysis. The grandmother case gives me a concrete, adjudicated backdrop of harm. It is proof that I was known, or should have been known, as high risk and structurally vulnerable. That strengthens the argument that state actors owed me heightened care, not less, that their failures are more serious, not less, because they were dealing with someone whose vulnerability was obvious and documented. It also cracks one of the state's favorite minimizations. This is just family drama. What I'm asking the tribunal to call it is exploitation of a child's injury settlement to acquire land, decades of control over housing and labor using that land, homophobic and transphobic conditions placed on access to shelter, and weaponization of police and institutions when the victim resists. Once that is written down in legal language, I will be able to say to ministries, insurers, hospitals, and courts, open quote, stop calling this family drama. The human rights body has recognized it as structural discrimination and exploitation. When you, as the Crown or as a hospital or insurer, repeat the same pattern, you are not neutral. You are continuing the colonizer script at a larger scale. Close quote. In that sense, my grandmother functions as a first-line colonizer proxy and state actors as second-line amplifiers who had a duty to break the pattern and instead reinforced it. The HRTO case will also produce evidence that spills over into my other files, my sworn application and any affidavit, her response showing how she minimizes, omits, or distorts, mediation or hearing transcripts, and potentially written findings of fact. All of that can be attached in judicial reviews, civil suits for negligence, unjust enrichment, or intentional infliction of mental suffering, and complaints to regulators and oversight bodies. Those materials will show that my testimony has been consistent over time. I am not changing my story, and that institutions have been consistent in their tactics. If the HRTO even partially finds in my favor, it becomes a precedent of me being believed, which I can then use to reopen or challenge past decisions where I was dismissed as unreliable, without anyone ever grappling with this history. My grandmother has no policy camouflage.